Hello, welcome. Dr. Sushma Singh this side. Today in Unit 27, Industrialization, we are going to start our lecture with topic Industrialization in India. Industrialization, as we know, is a term that is specifically employed to indicate the use of machines in the production process. It is also generally believed that industrial revolution in England has propelled industrialization not only in England but elsewhere too also. This easy connection with technological innovation and revolution to industrialization makes one ask whether similar conditions existed in India and whether industries were developing in an indigenous fashion and what role colonization had on the development of industries or deindustrialization of already existing industries. Post-independence India saw industrial policies being shaped by not only the aspect of colonialism but it was also informed by dominant paradigms of development discourse and by contemporary politics. Let us look at colonial phase of industrialization before we examine the industrialization in post-independence India. Colonization of India and industrialization. Whenever there is a discussion on industrialization in India, the colonial state is brought to center stage. It is held by many that the empire hurdled development in India. Apologists of the empire often cite examples of British investments in infrastructure, etc., as laying the ground for further industrialization. The other arguments highlights the disastrous result of the colonialism on the indigenous economies, completely taking it out of competitive edge which it had a textile industry. This argument was particularly favored by the nationalists who at that time argued for increased control of governance by the natives. Dadabhai Naoroji's Drain of Wealth and R.C. Dutt's work of Economic History of India had become works that were part of the nationalist historiography. The nationalists argued that competition with cheap British mill cloth drove Indians out of the handloom industry and into agriculture. There is another argument which does not agree with the notions that India was stagnant till the British came and took over. A view shared by the people like Marx as well, though he pointed out to the exploitative nature of colonialism. Against this notion of Oriental stagnation were arguments from historians like Irfan Habib, who says that the economy was far from stagnant. Hamza Alvi writes, quoting historical sources, that the Indian society of the 17th century, except for its military and especially naval weakness, was fully equal in the arts of manufacture and agriculture and culture to the European at the time. Contrary to the stereotype of the medieval Indian society as a stagnant rural backwater, we find evidence of a high degree of urbanization. Habib speaks of multitudes of artisans, peons and servants found in the towns. In 120 big cities and 3,200 townships in the second half of the 16th century, he adds that Agra and Fatehpur Sikri, twin cities, were each held to be larger than London. Delhi was held to be as populous as Paris, then the biggest city in Europe. A high proportion of the Indian urban population was employed in industrial crafts. The manufacturing industry was geared not only to the luxury consumption of the aristocracy and the more modest needs of the population in general, but also a rapid growing volume of exports. Naqvi points out that since the 17th century there was a wide growth of cities and towns as centers of cotton manufacturers. Hamza Alvi and many of the dependency theorists argue that capitalism was a global phenomena from the outset, not only by way of trade but also by way of extraction of resources from the colonies that underpinned capital accumulation in the metropolis like British Empire. In other words, the resources from colonies were used to fuel the mills and factories of Manchester and other places of England. What started off as unfair trade soon made way to plunder and greed. Not only did the British protect their domestic industry by imposing heavy duty on Indian textiles, but once they started to rule India, they collected revenues, taxes, and other impositions. Once the East India Company acquired a large local source of funds in the form of land revenue, it was no longer necessary for Britain to pay for India's textile export in billions and precious stone as it had so far done. It could now buy Indian textile from the wealth that it extracted from Indian. Textiles for export were brought from the huge amounts of land revenues that now accrued to the company and its employees. It was now to be a one-sided flow of unrequited export from India to Britain. It was to be spoken of by Indian nationalists as the economic drain from India. In the early phase of colonialism, there was very little capital investment in India. However, to aid trade to England, infrastructure like railway, telegraph, post, etc. were introduced. The capital investment which followed eventually was from English entrepreneurs and capitalists who wanted to be closer to raw material and cheap labor. They also enjoyed the patronage of empire. Very few Indian entrepreneurs started manufacturing business as British policies did not favor them, and they were reluctant to enter into unknown fields. There were, however, several business communities who were initially the collaborators and middlemen with British, like the Parsis and Marwadis who ventured into the setting up industries. The Marwadis of Calcutta moved from being traders to industrialists in the jute business. The transformation of a few Marwadis families from traders to industrialists was gradual. This pattern can be described in the following steps. They slowly increased their importance in the trade of raw jute and jute manufacturers. Some of the Marwari traders became members of the formal jute trade organizations. Others became brokers to British managing agency houses or by buying shares got a place on the board of directors of British managing agency houses. Finally, in the early 1920s, a few Marwaris entered the jute industries by setting up their own jute mills. The Billas started their first jute mill in 1919s, whereas Goenka and Bangur started there after World War II. The Parsi community, on the other hand, did not face stiff opposition from the British like Marwaris. They were the collaborators of British and sympathized with them. They partly financed the military defense of the Bombay fort. They were loyal to British during the mutiny, financing the British military apparatus. Third, a part of the Parsi community was fast to recognize that it was very useful to learn English, to adopt British customs, and to intensify their relation with the British in order to improve the socio-economic position of the community in West India. The Parsi were among the first to build up the Indian cotton textile industry in Bombay. Parsis owned 9 of 10 mills built in Bombay between 1854 and 1863. This included 2 mills of the Petit family. In the period between 1878 and 1915, the Parsi owned between 41 and 30% of the mills in the city. Apart from these communities, the bankers of Ahmedabad, without any British intervention or association, started setting up mills. After this initial foray, many trading families started to invest in industrial enterprise. This challenged the monopoly of British capitalists. The government started adopting discriminatory policies towards them. The tariff, taxation, and transport policies were made favorable to the British capitalists. Thus, there was stiff competition in the marketing of goods as well. The Indian capitalists organized themselves into Federation of Indian Chambers of Commerce and Industry, FICCI. The capitalists were aware that they would be better off in a free India and were active supporters of nationalist struggles. The leadership of the national movement were also aware of the need for industrialization of the country. Here we want to close this lecture. Thanks for listening.